Here. I think Councilmember White is not in town today, so I don't. So we'll make sure he watches the whole thing. Here we go. So this is being is this being televised, or we're just on? We're recording, right? Yes. No. Is this being televised? Is the question. Okay. All right. Well, then make sure we use the mic. All right. There we go. All right. Do we have any public comment for items not on the agenda? Something other than something related to homelessness? Okay. Seeing none, I will close the public comment period and bring it over to Sue Gray. Hello again. We just saw you yesterday.
Thank you, Madam Mayor, council members. Sue Gray, Community Development Business Manager. At the December 14th council budget work session, staff was asked to schedule a special council meeting on homelessness and housing, including a description of the efforts the city is making to reduce homelessness and its impacts. So today we will be discussing the efforts that the city has participated in over the years to lessen homelessness and its impacts, provide a brief overview of city-sponsored affordable housing, provide a brief overview of direct funding support that the city provides for homeless shelters and services, talk a little bit about additional costs of city services to respond to homelessness, and then end today with a presentation from the Central Coast Collaborative on Homelessness. Homelessness is a complex issue that's been attributed to a lack of affordable housing, poverty, lack of affordable health care, domestic violence, mental illness, and addiction. Over the years, the city has supported and or participated in numerous strategies to reduce homelessness and its impacts. Back in the 1980s, there was a City-County Homeless Advisory Committee that was formed, and it was a long-standing committee. It consisted of elected representatives from the county and the city. That group dealt with numerous strategies to reduce homelessness and its impacts, and it gave a voice to people who had concerns. In 2006, the advisory committee became the South Coast Homeless Advisory Committee, and it expanded to include elected representatives from the county, the City of Santa Barbara, City of Goleta, and City of Carpinteria, as well as members from shelter providers, housing providers, service providers, advocacy groups, and homeless individuals. That group dealt with issues such as jail release, handling of individuals' possessions when they were arrested, hazardous weather protocol for people living on the streets, and funding for homeless service providers. The city also participated in the 10-year plan to end chronic homelessness, or Bringing Our Community Home. That started in 2005 as a national initiative led by the United States Interagency Council on Homelessness. A plan was developed that included strategies and staffing to end chronic homelessness. It's unfortunate that funding to implement the plan was never materialized. However, that was the first countywide effort regarding homelessness, and it introduced Housing First to the community as a strategy to end chronic homelessness. In 2008, Council formed a subcommittee on homelessness and community relations to study a range of issues related to homelessness, services, and neighborhood impacts. The committee developed 12 strategies to address community issues related to homelessness. And some of the positive outcomes from that include a more restrictive panhandling ordinance, a panhandling education and alternate giving campaign, city financial support for affordable housing projects for homeless individuals, coordination of 100 most vulnerable, that was the creation of the list, which is now the vulnerability list, and the biweekly housing placement call. A recommendation for capital improvements to mitigate the effects of homelessness, funding to support the Project Recovery's Detox Center, which was needed at the time, an expansion of restorative policing from 1 to 2 police officers, and the addition of 3 part-time outreach workers and 6 part-time community service liaisons, and the development of restorative court. This subcommittee also recommended that council approve the consolidation of the South Coast Homeless Advisory Council, Common Ground, and the 10-year plan, and this became the community, it became C3H, Central Coast Collaborative on Homelessness. C3H is governed by a policy council of 10 elected representatives, 2 county board of supervisors, 2 city council members from Santa Barbara, 2 city council members from Santa Maria, and 1 council member from Carpinteria, Goleta, Solvang, and Lompoc. And you will hear more about C3H towards the end. They're going to have their own presentation. So a little bit about affordable housing. City provides assistance for the development and preservation for housing, affordable housing for households up to 80% of the median income. We do that through loans, through grants, and through development incentives. Capital A affordable means that they are subject to long-term affordability, or they're owned and operated by nonprofit housing sponsors such as the Housing Authority, People's Self-Help Housing, Transition House. The total affordable housing units in the city, the capital A affordable equal 8.3 of the total city housing stock. There's another 4.7% that is affordable through the Housing Authority's Shelter Plus Care Section 8 program. So that means that 13% of the total units in the city are considered affordable. In addition, there are 4 projects in the pipeline. When completed, they will add 202 additional affordable units: Gardens on Hope, Grace Village, Johnson Court, and Jardín de las Rosas. The city has provided $3.8 million in direct financial support for 12 projects. What did I say? Oh, I'm sorry, 34.8. It's much bigger. For 12 projects that include designated units for the homeless, including the development of 168 units for homeless individuals and families, and the preservation of 179 units that house formerly homeless persons. This slide shows the source of the $34.8 million. As you can see, the large majority of it came from the city's redevelopment agency, the Housing Set-Aside Funds. Unfortunately, that money is no longer available to us as the agency dissolved in 2012. The next largest portion is home funding, which comes from the Federal Department of Housing and Urban Development. This funding has decreased 60% since 2011. It's gone from $864,000 a year to $363,000. The community development block grant funds that are shown in this chart, those are for rehabilitation only. We can't use the community development block grant funds for new development. So those are the ones that helped on the preservation side. And then several years ago, we received some socioeconomic mitigation program and help funds. So that's a small portion. We no longer receive those funds. So this pie really shows how much our funding for permanent housing, homeless housing, even affordable housing has decreased. And this is just a list of the projects that make up the $34.8 million. Bradley is the highest. That was one of the last ones with the RDA funds. That one, and Jardín de las Rosas at the end. The city also provides annual grants to social service agencies that provide assistance to homeless programs. The yellowish section and the lavender section, those are both general fund dollars. So more than half of the money the city is providing for homeless services comes straight from the general fund. The next largest slice is home funding, and the home funding in this category is tenant-based rental assistance. Since our allocation has decreased so much, we don't really have a lot of money to provide funding for new development, so we've been spending some funding on tenant-based rental assistance. And the community development block grant funds, that is the 15% that we are allowed to spend of the community development block grant monies for public services. This slide shows the types of services funded, homeless services funded with money. Shelter and transitional housing is the largest, followed by the rent subsidies, and then supportive services, coordination, and prevention. This is just a listing of some of the shelter transitional housing programs that we've funded this year. I'm not going to list them all, but you can see them. The rent subsidy, tenant-based assistance, that is the home funding, and we are allowed with that money to provide tenant-based rental assistance and security deposit assistance for up to 2 years. And we currently have agreements with the Housing Authority, PATH, and Transition House. And each of those provides assistance to a different homeless population and different kinds of assistance. For instance, PATH usually provides only security deposit and first month's rent. Housing Authority provides the assistance to people who are on their waiting list, homeless people, so they kind of go up to the 2-year limit at times, and Transition House falls somewhere in between. This is just showing the supportive services that we provide. That's only 7% of the money that we expend on homeless services. And prevention, 5%. The 8% for coordination is the Central Coast Collaborative on Homelessness. In addition to the direct funding that we provide for housing and services, there are also a cost for city services that are related to homelessness. And at this time, I'd like to turn it over to Rich Hanna from Parks and Rec, and he'll be followed by Jessica Cadiente from the library, and then Chief Lunau from the police department.
Madam Mayor and council members, Rich Hanna, Assistant Parks and Recreation Director. I'd like to first acknowledge many of the positives that are included in today's report. But I'd like to add that many of the positive progress for our department is still underway in Parks and Recreation. As a department, we continue to experience items of misuse at our parks and recreation facilities, and over the last decade, we have seen an increase in criminal activities that limit broad enjoyment of our public and parks and recreation spaces. Our staff and the public are subject to illegal and aggressive behaviors on a daily basis, and that includes frequent drug use, excessive alcohol use, prostitution, and undesirable overnight camping. More recently, the department has had to work through the provision of free meals and services in parks, and we have a little success story to share with you at the end of these slides. Next slide. So some of the impacts that the public and our staff experience on a daily basis include park avoidance and perceived safety concerns. People just choose to work out in different areas, not use parks in their neighborhoods, and choose other places to go and frequent. We've seen an increase in vandalism, increase on park resources and maintenance as it relates to large gatherings, which leave behind an excessive amount of trash. We're dealing with encampments and resources related to overnight camping. And all of those things put a price on our staff resources that relates to that. And then in general, we're just seeing lower program participation, facility rentals, and revenue. And as a department that relies a lot on making revenue through our programs and participation in facility rentals, when we have undesirable use in our parks, it's easy for parents to decide to move their activities to another location. So what's in our tool chest is Parks and Recreation. So some of the strategies that we've been employing to increase safety and usability at the parks involve increased schedule activity in parks. We've been working with local youth providers like Pony Baseball, Special Olympics, to increase activity at Ortega Park and provide them with, as much as possible, a safe environment to use restrooms and auxiliary facilities in the park. We've been working successfully. We've had 3 meals with local meal and service providers that provide services at Alameda and Plaza Del Mar to work through just how can we better communicate to make sure that these services take place? We're aware of what's taking place at those free meals and service locations, and then work with the health department to make sure that the food and the resources that are being provided there are at a level for a population that is already kind of vulnerable to other health concerns. And I'd like to report that we've had successful meetings, and all of these things have been moved forward at no cost to the service providers. As a department, we've been working to modify and expand our park ranger schedule. We've just cleared our third park ranger, so he's now into the rotation. So we've been able to expand service to include 7 days a week, coverage at our parks and recreation facilities, and expand the schedule to start at 6:30 in the morning and conclude at 9:30 at night. And then lastly, the last thing that we have in our toolbox is really just to meet quarterly with the police department, to share observations, coordinate resources, and make sure that we're working together to make our parks more usable and increase usability in our parks and safety for everybody. And so that concludes my presentation, and I believe Ms. Caliente is up after me.
Madam Mayor, are you taking questions now or afterwards?
Wait to the end.
Thank you.
Madam Mayor, City Council, Jessica Cadiente, Library Director. Thank you for having me today. Unlike the Parks and Rec Department, the library actually follows guidelines and bylaws set forth to us by the American Library Association. And we do find it within our mission to serve the poor and homeless populations. But what we find is that there is a mission creep occurring in that the storage of people's belongings, bathing, the basic human needs that people who are homeless need every day continue to occur at our libraries. We have had to do significant training with our staff in order to prepare them for handling all of these different issues. We do not have security at our libraries, and so all of our staff are ready and prepared, but we do spend a significant amount of staff time in that preparation. We also do a lot of training on what are the referrals. We have significant amounts of documentation that we can hand out and give to people for where they can go. So this is all training. It's estimated that 1/3 of the people who are homeless do suffer from some mental illness, and so we take that seriously, and we've had to send staff to week-long mental illness training so they can come back and teach the rest of the staff how to handle these situations. And next slide. One of the biggest impacts is our public perception that our library is not safe, that it's not a place where people want to come because of what they consider an unsafe environment. A statistic that I can pull from the Children's Library being open in its new floor increased our circulation numbers by over 100,000 items because the parents felt like they now had a safe place to take their children. So it does decrease our ability to have people coming to our library. And then again, the enforcement, cleanup, custodial issues are a daily occurrence for us. We do have to have custodial service every hour we're open to handle so many of the issues that come up throughout the day.
Good afternoon, Madam Mayor and Council. First, I want to say I am extremely proud by the level of compassion our officers serve this community, especially our homeless population. So I want to first start out by pointing out this first slide, or I should say the first bullet's a little deceptive in regards to the documented cases or calls for service that we handle with transients or homeless population at 5,134. We don't have a call designator for homelessness or transients. We create the calls based on behaviors. So we don't ask. Those are the calls that some citizens or call takers have classified as transient. So it shows that it's almost 6% of all of our calls for service. Anecdotally, any of our officers will tell you well over more than half of our calls for service are nuisance related due to our homeless population. So in saying that, we do have resources dedicated to some of our challenges, our tactical patrol force. We have 6 sworn officers and a sergeant. Those are the ones that you see typically on our bicycles that focus on those nuisances that are called in. And I think more importantly, they have the proactive ability to take on the problems they see day to day. They're also our officers that conduct the camp cleanups for us. Next slide. Definitely our flagship program, I think, deserves a lot of attention for our efforts in the restorative policing arena. Everybody knows no two people are alike. Their problems are extremely different. The fact that we have the ability to have a sworn officer and 2 civilian positions to focus on the needs of our population have shown great successes, and in the last 5 years, they've successfully helped over 630 people, and those statistics, I think, speak for themselves. 16% were reunited with families, 13% were placed in housing with 0 evictions, 65% were connected to mental health services or social services, and 67% entered detox or substance abuse programs with a 48% completion rate. So, from my perspective, the fact that we have that, and there was a recent news story in regards to one of our most vulnerable people that had been in our community for 10 years, her family was looking for, and we, because of our collaborative relationship and the restorative process that our district attorney supports and College Hospital supports, we were able to link pieces of information together to truly get that person the help they deserve. So that is it. And we have a video that represents that.
All aspects of society. In Santa Barbara, the issues surrounding homelessness ripple into our community's ability to provide not only basic services to those most in need, but also to the community at large.
There are people that are homeless or soon to be homeless are trapped in a reoccurring state of either mental illness and or drug dependency. And we get called when they're involved in some nuisance-related problem resulting in negative police contact. 10% of the people we deal with are 90% of the problem. They draw the biggest draw on our community. They take up ambulance services. They take up first responder services.
To address these problems, the police department establishes personal contact with the goal of breaking the cycle of citation, incarceration, and addiction.
In July of 2011, City Council decided to augment or enhance our efforts towards restorative policing, which is really trying to restore people a life of dignity, those who have found themselves living on the streets, many of whom are involved in the criminal justice system. And through our efforts to try to house them, they're constantly kind of being recycled through the system. So our restorative policing efforts are to try to help those people regain a life of dignity and get them off the streets in a sober living facility.
For Nick Ferreira, homelessness was never something he believed could happen to him.
I came down with a medical condition that caused me to have horrendous headaches, double vision, crossed eyes, and I was not able to work anymore. I was placed in the position of basically just getting by day to day because of this medical condition. In the meantime, I also became addicted to the pain medications I was given for the problem. And so I lost everything. I lost my home, I lost my family, my child.
None of these people really prefer to be living like that. There are just so many things that have gone wrong along the way, so many missteps, so many wrong turns, that it's difficult for them to unravel it.
Through Santa Barbara's restorative policing efforts, the police department, court system, healthcare system, and social service agencies collaborate to get individuals off the streets by providing transitional housing, creating stability, and directing people to services they need.
Our ultimate goal is to reduce calls for service for our first responders, police, fire, paramedics. We want to reduce the amount of beds that are used at Cottage Hospital and out at county jail. In doing so, there's a huge cost savings that the community will recognize. It's not an easy process, and it's not always timely. And simply because we're never in charge of when somebody makes the decision to change their lifestyle. But being omnipresent in the community, always being available when they are ready, is what's making our program really helpful.
I personally believe that everybody should have an opportunity to reach their full potential. Homeless people are marginalized. Even after they get housed, in many ways they're marginalized. And that's one new avenue of change I think that needs to be explored, is the opportunity for everybody to reach their full potential.
Okay, at this time, I would like to introduce Chuck Flax, the Executive Director of the Central Coast Collaborative on Homelessness.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon, Madam Mayor and members of the City Council. C3H, the Central Coast Collaborative on Homelessness, is the name says it. We are about collaboration and about regional work. And in the city of Santa Barbara, we've had some of our greatest success through work that Luke Barrett, who's our regional coordinator for the South Coast, will describe. But I wanted to introduce him and to thank you for the generous support that the city provides us on an annual basis. We couldn't do this work without many of the people in the room, because that's what we're about. We're a small organization with just a handful of staff, but we work day in and day out with people here to make it happen. And truthfully, we know how to end homelessness. It's not an unsolvable problem of enormous cost. It's really about getting to know each of the people on the street, getting to know their needs, getting them into housing, and giving them the services they need to keep them housed. And many people in this room have done that day in and day out and done it successfully. And it's really more a matter of a shortage of resources, a shortage of affordable housing to enable us to really solve it in perpetuity. But I'm optimistic that it is a solvable problem and we have the right tools. And so now it's a matter of replicating what works. I'm going to introduce Luke Barrett and let him describe some of our successes and the work that we've been doing.
All right, thanks, Chuck, and good afternoon, Madam Mayor and City Council. I'm Luke Barrett. It's been a privilege to work for C3H for the last year and a half. It's just been really great experience. I picked two stories. We've worked with hundreds of people over the last year, but just two really good examples of how our work can kind of affect people differently. So we'll call him Jack. He's a long-time chronically homeless person in Santa Barbara who actually had just gotten housed when he had a horrible stroke. He was at the Victoria Hotel downtown, and if you know, it's upstairs. There's a long flight of stairs to get up there, and the units are upstairs. So he was so happy to have his unit, he wasn't going to tell anybody that he wasn't able to get up the stairs safely. He had just gotten in. And so with our working relationship with Cottage, we realized that he was going to the ER a lot, like almost every day with really serious kind of fall injuries and problems. And he had just gotten out because of the stroke, so we were concerned. And through a regional coordination meeting, which we actually hosted at Cottage, we had the social work department, the ER staff, a bunch of the outreach folks, the shelters, and fortunately the housing authority and People Self-Help all in the room. And so when this guy's name came up as one of the highest hospital utilizers for that year, everyone was like astounded because they thought he was just up there living in his house being fine. Turns out he couldn't walk down the stairs safely and kept falling over and over and over again. He'd go to the hospital, get stabilized, go back home, sometimes make it up the stairs, sometimes not, and then fall and go to the ER. This happened over and over and over again. And in the meeting, in the course of an hour, we realized he can't live there safely. And the City Housing Authority was super flexible and automatically agreed to work with Peoples to find him another unit right then. Within a month, he had a ground floor unit. He had a ton of support in home and hasn't been in the hospital since. It took one meeting, getting all the right people in the room, understanding it was a problem, that we all have a part of the puzzle. Really cool, great success story. Another one, Cindy. She's about 50, 55, wheelchair bound for most of her life. She was on State Street for the better part of 10 years. She's from Santa Barbara, born and raised local. Life just kind of went sideways over time. A lot of things happened, and kind of like that 2 steps forward, 1 step back her whole life. Ends up in front of the 99-cent store on State Street for years. And when we started working with downtown Santa Barbara, Bob Stout from the Wildcat was really interested in how can I help? How can I get out there and meet homeless folks and find a way to really help people in my area? So we partnered him up with one of the outreach folks from Common Ground back then, Claudia Lopez, who was amazing. And they were just walking down the street and met Cindy. And they kind of connected with her and clicked and heard her life story. And from that interaction, she became a client of our outreach team, our really intensive case management team. She's been housed for 6 or 7 months now because of that interaction. And she is walking. She's out of the wheelchair. She got a hip replacement, which she needed for years and years and years. She's completely independent, living on her own, doing great, off drugs, just really, really a success story. And it wouldn't have happened without the support of the business community, especially Bob Stout, and that outreach combination. So all we did really was make the connection and kind of follow it up. But those connections really matter. Thanks. Okay, so we do a few things in the city here. We have regional coordination, which is quarterly now. Last year it was every month, and we dialed it back a little bit. That's a chance for us to get together and have a really deep kind of problem-solving session. So we poll the agencies we work with, a lot of them in the room here, and say, what's going on with you? What at your agency has been a problem over and over again lately? Let's all get together and talk about it. So things like traumatic brain injuries, vehicle homelessness, pets, what to do with pets when people are in the hospital and jail, things like that. We've worked through a lot of those problems together. We also have a lot of professional development opportunities. So we bring professional expert level speakers together to provide education for homeless service providers. And that's worked out really well for quite a few events now. We also are on the Downtown Safety Committee, the PATH Neighborhood Partnership, and the COC. Rich did a great job explaining the parks relationship. Our role was kind of to be the middleman. We worked with our friends who were the homeless advocates and the service providers and connected them with the parks and the city staff to find a way to create permits for the food and the medical services that happen in the parks. They've been going on for years, but it was kind of this rogue operation for a while, and now we've actually had everyone on the same page. There's permits in process, and it really worked out well. I think the parks got what they needed, and the providers got a lot of comfort knowing that their presence is actually sanctioned now. That's been good. We also got 17 people reunified to out-of-town family or programs, and that's something we do with downtown Santa Barbara primarily. They solicit donations from businesses, just private donations, and our role is to find people who have a better place to go. It's not shipping people out of town. It's meeting them and figuring out, oh, you have family in Texas and you just can't get there because you can't afford the bus ticket. Small little barriers like that, if they have a better situation for them somewhere to go and it's just a train ticket or a bus ticket away, we use the private donations to make that happen. So we had 17 last year. Our coordinated outreach team is our direct service component. So that's something that a C3H staff member actually leads every week. We have 23 clients right now, and those are typically the most vulnerable people. They are the ones who go to the ER the most, have the most police contacts, have the most neighborhood impact. And we work together with a host of different agencies, including a lot of the county departments, to provide interagency, really intensive case management for them. We've had some success. Last year, we had 5 new people get into housing. We provide support for 18 months after they get into housing as well. So like Chuck mentioned, it's really hard to keep people in housing. The work kind of starts when they move in. So we've done housing support for 10 people last year. And we have 13 who are still in the streets that we're being case managed right now. We are really interested in data and connecting agencies however we can. And so one thing we do is a biweekly phone call where we get housing providers and a lot of the service providers on the phone together just for an hour, where the service providers can talk about their clients as well as who's the most vulnerable on that list we mentioned earlier. And that gives everyone a chance just to have a quick conversation, get an update on their progress towards housing. This is one of my pet projects. We have a great database. It's called Vertical Change. The unique thing about it is that it connects the homeless service providers and creates a lot of transparency. That's something we didn't have, at least in my experience, before. It allows us to look a client up and figure out, oh, you're working with Safe Parking, you're working with PATH, you're working with Salvation Army, and share notes between the providers, which historically has been a pretty difficult barrier. That's really been great, and it's kind of just begun. It's how we manage the VI SPDAT data, the survey we use to measure vulnerability. And it's also a way we can track housing placements and keep track of who's working with each individual and how we can coordinate services for them better. The final thing is a common housing app that's just maybe 6 months old, 8 months old. But we realize that one of the main reasons homeless folks don't get into housing is because they can't meet all the bureaucratic administrative requirements. There's just a lot of forms you have to fill out. You have to be able to receive mail or receive email or have a phone. And a lot of the folks we work with don't have email. They don't have a phone. They don't have a mailing address. They're not able to do those forms on their own. So we developed a paper form that one of our staff or an outreach worker or any nonprofit partner can go out into the field, sit down with them wherever they're at, on a street corner in a park, get all the information, and then do the housing app on their behalf and follow up with it on their behalf. So just kind of a way we're trying to bridge that gap. The point in time count. You have a printed report in front of you on the council. There's a lot in there. The bottom line for Santa Barbara City was 790 was the count for 2017. And that's a baseline. We know there's at least 790 homeless people in Santa Barbara City. And we did the best we could to cover all the areas we knew people would be. We worked with all the facilities, all the shelters, all the programs. So it's definitely in the ballpark, but it's impossible to cover every single square inch on one night. So that's pretty close. It has been trending downward consistently for the last 8 years, which we're really happy about. And a lot of that's, a testament to the work of the folks in the room who work all day long to get people into housing and help keep them there. Santa Barbara's been really successful with the homeless service providers. In your packet, you might also notice after the Santa Barbara region, there's a breakdown by Milpas area and by downtown specifically, and a snapshot of homeless young adults in Santa Barbara. So there's some more detail for you to look at if you're interested. Next. And Chuck's going to talk about the future.
Unfortunately, the future will not include Luke Barrett, so we're sad he's announced a transition, and we're going to be looking for a replacement, although that may not be entirely possible. C3H I want to remind the council, is a county-wide organization, and so we work regionally in every major city, and that's reflected in the point-in-time count report. Part of the reason the point-in-time count was so successful this year is because we've been able to coordinate service providers and have interactions with the homeless community throughout the county in a variety of different regions. I'm going to describe our future goals for the city of Santa Barbara, but our future hopes are broader in terms of leveraging significant more resources. If you've been keeping up with what's happening in Los Angeles, they just passed a bond measure, $1.2 or $1.9 billion bond measure for 8,000 to 10,000 new units of housing construction. And they passed a sales tax to fund services for homeless providers. That was largely orchestrated by partnerships with the business community and the United Way called Home for Good. And we're going to try to replicate that program here in Santa Barbara and try to do it countywide. And we'll be counting on partners here. Future goals for us, we want to make sure that the data management system functions effectively for everybody, and that we are actually getting real-time data reported. So one of the things you'll see on our website is going to be real-time data from the VI SPDAT surveys, and we're going to have that up in the next 3 to 4 months. We're expanding our partnership with Cottage Health. We're still working on what that exactly is going to look like. We recently received funding from Dignity Health to support their placement of high-cost utilizers who are homeless in the community, and we may be doing something similar with Cottage. We'd love to expand coordinated outreach. I mean, everything is dependent on budget, and so we'll see whether that can work. People frequently ask us about job training and employment for people who are homeless, and this is an area that I think could be expanded really across the board. And we're going to, I come out of a background in employment services, and I'm going to be making inroads into the public workforce system here to see what linkages we can establish with our existing clients. We're working closely with the downtown organization to expand and enhance the reunification program as much as possible. We don't want to advertise that we're doing this because we don't want to give a sense that we're just providing free transportation for people out of town. The idea is really to do a good job triaging and ensuring that people are getting to places where they really need to be. we also want to make sure that we're improving our interagency collaboration. Sue calls our work coordination, and I'd love to tell you that it's a seamless process where we're working closely with everybody and everybody's working together and singing from the same hymnal. And that isn't true, but it is true that we have a very good working relationship. And so the hope is that we start to formalize some of those conditions, and actually there's some mandates from HUD to do that. It's called coordinated entry, and it's something that we are going to be working with the continuum of care on and developing more interagency agreements. And I would be remiss if I know that this is off script. I hope I don't get in trouble, but there were two important components that were turned down recently by the Community Development Committee of our work. And actually, Glenn Batchelor is here, and he may address them directly. The Landlord Liaison Program and then the Common Ground Outreach Program, both of which are not a huge budget items, but for whatever reason were passed over by the committee. They're pretty critical, frankly, to the work that we're doing. They're key components of this continuum that we've developed here in Santa Barbara. And so we're actually asking and hoping for some reconsideration from the council, which is relatively unprecedented, but I just wanted to put that out there as well. We're obviously here to answer questions, as are the rest of the staff, and thank you for your time.
Do you have any else before I open up to questions, Sue?
Nope.
Okay.
There's plenty of people here to answer questions. There's
Great.
other service providers
All
as
right.
well.
And I know we'll have time for public comment as well, but first, if there are any questions, and before we get into any comments from council, Randy, go ahead.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. I wonder if Ms. Caliente could come up and had a question about the library and some of the issues you talked about. Not long ago, council passed some regulations for postings around the library regarding behaviors that were exclusive to your grounds and plaza and whatnot. And frankly, I got to admit, I haven't looked lately. But are they posted, and do they help, or is it a matter of having personnel to enforce those regulations?
Yes. All of the postings have been up for several months, and while those rules of conduct do help, it's still a daily task with the enforcement.
At one point in time, I know it was kind of a disturbing report, but we understood that part of the library budget involved some security. Is that no longer happening, or did that happen in the past? Or maybe I have that wrong.
There was a library monitor program in the past that no longer exists.
Okay, very good. Thank you.
Ms. Maria, you had a question, I know. Did you?
Yes, thank you. Well, Mr. Hanna had painted a dark picture, but then Mr. Barrett came up and said that you've been working with the people or the entities that provide meals. Thank you, Mr. Hanna. Well, yeah, please, let me ask you then. So you've been working with the, I think, Doctors Without Walls. They provide services. And then is it some churches that provide meals? So there is a process by which they're working with the Parks Department to make things okay?
Sure, Madam Mayor and Councilmember Murillo. So we've been working with a large stakeholder group that includes Doctors Without Walls, faith-based organizations, and then other groups in town that provide services at primarily Alameda Park and then Plaza Del Mar. The process started with just bringing everybody together and really understanding what everybody needed to learn about each other and what we expected when folks were using the park, something we would expect from everybody. So through that process, we've moved to a point where I would say there's a permit process in place. We've involved Santa Barbara County Health, and I'd say things are moving in a positive direction. We're rolling it out at Alameda, and we then hope to take that same model and apply it to Plaza Del Mar.
What were the problems created by the meal service? So it was just a lot of people congregating there, or they weren't picking up their trash?
I think it was partly there was a lot of trash left behind, and what we found out when we met with the stakeholders was that they actually had an internal checklist and they were doing things that we weren't aware of at the park. But what we find is when large groups come to the parks, not everybody leaves when the food sharing program is over. That we found there was an excessive amount of trash that gets left behind that we had to take care of as a department. We had some issues where restrooms close in parks and so forth, and what would those individuals do when they were in the parks, and just a really general increase in maintenance expectations from our park staff in maintaining the parks.
Okay. Well, I'm glad that we're working on resolving those issues. I've been with Doctors Without Walls before in the parks, and it seems like they do amazing work there. Otherwise, those people wouldn't get that medical care. So, but thank you. And Madam Mayor, is it okay to ask Ms. Stotts a question about the CDBG Human Resources program, because Mr. Flax brought it up, and
I'll let her come on up. I'm gonna
Yeah.
appreciate. Mr. Flax was on the committee. I'm gonna well, you resigned before the thing got started, so we missed your input as part of that. So but if you want to ask those questions there, but those are legitimate. There's it's a legitimate issue coming up with that budget.
But while she's making her way up, Madam Mayor, what I understand is we have a finite funding amount of money, and the other programs scored higher on a very careful scoring ranking point system. So if we were to say the two programs that you're talking about, that means two other programs that scored higher would be bumped, unless we want to talk about finding more money for the other two programs. And I really respect the CDBG Human Resources Committee. And Ms. Stotts, maybe you can describe that for us, please. And then also tell us, go ahead.
Sure. Councilmember Murillo, Madam Mayor, thank you. We're going to be repeating all of this on the 28th of March, so the public is welcome. We're having a public hearing on the committee's recommendations. So I'll give a quick overview on what the program is. It's as Sue already described, the CDBG and Human Services Program. We make funding available for these organizations. We have about 50 to 60 organizations apply for funding every year. We have a public committee that reviews and interviews all the applicants and make recommendations to council. And unfortunately, there isn't enough money to go around, and there are organizations that do not get their funding requests. And that was the reality with these two particular organizations.
And it was the Landlord Liaison and Common Ground? Was that the other one?
Those were two of them.
Do you remember off the top of your head the dollar figure that...
I think Sue has that.
Thank you.
Madam Mayor, Councilmember Murillo, the Common Ground application was for $22,000 and Landlord Liaison was $20,000.
Okay. That's a pretty sizable amount of money, I think, for these grants, right? That's on the high side, Ms. Stotts, or no?
They're about average.
About average, okay. So I'm just putting this information out there because you've started this conversation, and Mr. Batchelor has contacted me at least. I'm not sure if he's contacted everyone. And so this is a sensitive situation, and I'm glad we're having the conversation because I really respect Common Ground and Landlord Liaison, but also the other programs. So thank you, Madam Mayor.
Mr. Dominguez, you had a question also?
Yes, for Mr. Hanna. You mentioned in your presentation the illegal and aggressive behavior, and I'm wondering if the Parks Department is working on a strategic plan to combat those issues.
Sure, Madam Mayor and Councilmember Dominguez. Really, our plan is to work more closely with the Santa Barbara Police Department. The Parks and Recreation mission is really to serve members of this community, visitors and tourists and citizens, with providing free, safe, clean parks and quality recreation programs. We have a limited role in the enforcement process through our park ranger program, but in terms of working to eliminate aggressive behaviors and some of these other issues that we encounter at our parks and where we host a lot of youth activity programs, we don't specifically have a strategic plan in place at this time. It's something that we're looking to work with the police department to roll out.
Do you have a set of goals or benchmarks that you're shooting to achieve?
To be honest, at this time, we do not. One of the things that we've been working on since we went to our commission in December was really just to identify the types of challenges that we were faced with. And if you separate just the meal sharing and free services program, which I think we're making a lot of positive progress towards, some of these other issues, we've got, let's say, 10% of the population is causing 90% of the problems. And I'm not sure how we address those, whether it's through enforcement, through increased activity in our parks. We've gone in and removed, structures, benches, picnic areas, things like that, which are a detriment to the community that wants to use the park for the way that it was intended. So at this time, we don't have a benchmark. We were working more closely with the meal sharing programs at this point.
Great, thank you. Then I have a question for Mr. Flax.
And you'll be after Mr. Dominguez.
the city's report has some pie charts with some funds, and I'm curious, as someone who's been working very hard on this issue and very closely with the city, where would you push us as we're entering into our budgeting process? What are programs that we should double down on? What are programs that haven't seemed to be returning the value we expected? Is there a wish list you have, or?
So you're putting me on the spot.
Yep. Absolutely.
I couldn't make that recommendation just standing here. I would be happy to meet with you, to meet with other stakeholders. We had a really good meeting yesterday, actually, on some of these kinds of issues. I think one of the realities with our kind of homeless service system is we don't really have an evaluation process. We don't really know to a great extent the efficacy of one program versus another. What Santa Barbara seems to show, based both on the point in time count and based on the amount of investment of this city, is Santa Barbara is doing something right. I mean, we've seen a decrease year over year in the number of homeless people. The average number of people being housed by the service providers in this room and elsewhere is about 150 people a year who are from the streets into housing, and that's impressive. So I think. I think to the extent that more affordable housing can be created is probably the top priority from any. I mean, I think most folks here would agree with me on that the critical need countywide is affordable housing and truly housing of all levels that would allow for people to work and live close to where and have the kind of life they want to have. I mean, those are big issues, but the homeless population tends to reflect some of the things that are broken in a system. And so in what you see is, because people have mentioned mental health and alcohol and drug problems and lack of housing, those are three systems in our county that are broken. And so to the extent that we can work together as a community to address those issues, that's when you're going to start to see real improvement. That being said, I mean, just speaking somewhat selfishly, it's important from our perspective to increase the amount of resources for outreach. That all the agencies that are here that serve homeless people, I think, would love to see more resources to enable them to support people both before they come into their doors and after they're housed, because we've learned that you can't just put somebody in housing and expect them to succeed. So the paths and the transition houses and the Salvation Armies and these organizations depend on limited staff resources to provide ongoing support. And AmeriCorps has actually been a real game changer. I mean, for $9,000 a person full time, we've actually been able to use our AmeriCorps members to provide that kind of in-home support that many of our residents need. And that's been an amazing, I mean, if you're talking bang for the buck, that's been one of the most game-changing things I've seen that's happened in the last year, of being able to really provide that outreach and interface, getting to know people. So that's, I mean, I don't want to dodge your question. I think it's important that we understand what works and what doesn't. And I'm not sure we know definitively. We do know that people are working very hard on very limited budgets.
I'll track you down after this meeting, and I definitely want to commiserate with you on your loss of Luke. I hired Luke with Emily Allen, which means Emily Allen hired him, and I said yes when we were at Legal Aid Foundation. Emily's not here because she's in Santa Maria at a county-wide meeting, but it's going to be a big loss. Are you staying in the community?
No, Alaska, actually.
Okay, close.
Mr. Hotchkiss.
Thank you. Mr. Fox, if I could. We said in 2017 the point and count was 790 homeless here. I don't see that on the street. I'm not doubting your figure. I'm just wondering, where are those people? Because they're between State Street and Cabrillo and Milpas. There's nowhere near that number.
No. So, first of all, the city is larger, obviously, than those three locations. Secondly, I don't have the numbers in front of me. You do in the booklet, but a significant percentage of the people that we counted are in shelters. Okay. And Santa Barbara has a significant shelter capacity, right, between, I named some of them: Salvation Army, the Safe Parking Program, Rescue Mission, PATH. Do you know the numbers? How many beds is it? So according to our data, 144 people were unsheltered and counted. So that squares with my own perception of State Street, the beaches, that 144 is probably right in terms of the number of people on the street.
we try to transition people, not attract people in order to transition them, right? So PATH at one point, I think, still eliminated their lunchtime program. And the reports I had from the Milpas area were that had a dramatic effect in improving things. Therefore, would eliminating some of our programs maybe have a comparable effect? Not all of them, but you're the expert, so I would ask you.
So I would argue the opposite. I mean, I think,
You'd argue what?
I would argue the opposite, that,
Okay.
that if in fact it was true that intensive services increased the number of homeless people, then you would see an increase in Santa Barbara. And what we're seeing is a decrease.
Well,
So-
it decreased the effects on the Milpas neighborhood.
So it is, while it is, I mean, and this is similar to the park argument, when you provide services to people, there's a congregation effect. But I wouldn't say that attraction in and of itself is the problem. I think what you're pointing to, and a PATH would probably not disagree with me, was a managerial problem from the past. That once you serve people, if you're just going to let them go off and not provide any sort of supervision or support for the community, that can cause problems. And so part of the reason that we are focused so closely on working with the parks folks is that we think that services that are happening there are critical. And by managing that process effectively and working with both the recipients of the services and the providers of the services, that we'll see an effective use of the park and the resources.
Well, actually, for the Milpas neighborhood, I think you're incorrect. That actually drew people there, and they will tell you that, Milpas Association in particular. But I'm wondering, we're talking about the police came and talked about what % of their time was with dealing with homelessness, and yet, at least in the parks, and I'm going to ask Mr. Hanna about this, we're actually drawing people there, creating a problem, and then having to make our parks less attractive for everybody else. So we're sort of shooting ourselves in the foot there. Mr. Hanna, could we talk about that a little bit?
If I could quickly respond,
Yeah.
So, I mean, I would again make the argument that the presence of services is not the detriment, and that by the presence of homeless people is clearly a problem.
No.
And the parks is one area where, because Santa Barbara doesn't have a lot of spaces for people to go that are not private spaces, the parks become a de facto place, and that's true of the library as well. One of the solutions that was offered before that you mentioned was a day center at PATH. The community, again, I don't know the history, I wasn't here, but the community didn't like that location. But in many other places around the country, day centers is a way of providing the kinds of services we're talking about without impacting the public spaces. So in the case of, for example, San Francisco most recently has something called navigation centers, which are publicly funded centers for homeless people to get services that don't then detract from the public spaces. So just something else to think about.
You should deal directly, I think, with the PATH people. They're more expert than I am there. But, Mr. Hanna, if we eliminated the lunch programs that you're talking about in the parks, what effect would that have on our parks, do you think?
Councilmember Hotchkiss, so the programs that are actually being provided are actually in the evening, so they're kind of evening free meals and services programs, and they're really only hosted in 2 parks. At our commission meeting, we addressed that we had homeless issues in 20 of our 60 parks. So if we were to eliminate the
Alameda Park and
Alameda and Plaza Del Mar, so right down there by Pershing Park. So if we were to eliminate those services, it would be my opinion that those services would be provided in other places. It would just be moving the problem from Alameda to somewhere else.
Who would provide them at other places?
I don't think we have the resources right now to completely eliminate these services in our parks. And so if we were not to provide them at Alameda, I feel like the services would be provided at some other park within inside of our inventory.
Okay, well, that's not really answering my question. I'm talking about eliminating the program. So what happens if we do that? Whatever park, wherever park.
If we eliminated meal sharing and services from all of our parks, then those individuals would go somewhere else to get those services, and it wouldn't be a city park.
Okay, thank you. I think somebody's going to actually argue that later, but that's fine. Thank you very much.
A couple of questions. and I know Mr. Batchelor will probably talk about the landlord liaison project in public comment, but one of the, Sue Gray, one of the items of funding that was mentioned was the rent subsidy tenant-based assistance, and that's federal funds, remind me?
Madam Mayor, yes, those are federal home funds.
Okay, and so there's assuming we will still have home funds into the future, I know that's a whole other layer there, but assuming we did, is there a formula amount, and how does that funding work? I mean, we had, I think it was, what I see, about 430,000 or so a year.
We just sent out an RFP, and I believe we had 500,000. I'm looking at Deirdre.
Okay.
Available. So we're inviting applications, and we've heard from 4 different providers.
And but that's still, the RFP process is still open?
Yes,
Okay.
till the 23rd of March.
As in next week?
Yes.
So would the landlord liaison project be eligible for those kind of funds?
I don't believe so. It's basically a program where, let's take the Housing Authority, for example. We provide them with a chunk of money, say $100,000, and then they use that money for people who come in and they need assistance with rent.
And I think that's exactly what the landlord liaison project does, but I'll let Glenn, that's what that is. I just thought I'd put that out there and see if there's a nexus there or not, because that could be.
We can't use the funding for case management. There's a very small admin fee that can be reimbursed that goes with it. But otherwise, it's just the actual money that goes to the rent assistance.
The rent assistance, okay.
I had a question.
And yeah, when I'm done, you'll be next, absolutely. I see Mr. Fredericks from the Housing Authority here. I'm wondering if you can come up and talk about what you know, what's happening at the HUD, at the Housing and Urban Development level. I know CDBG funds is on the chopping block. That's its own issue. But in terms of Section 8, HUD, home funds, any other kinds of funding that you get currently, and what's at stake here with the federal budget?
Sure. Madam Mayor, City Council members, I shared with you some information on the Section 8 funding issues that we have since we're currently operating under a continuing resolution. There's no federal budget yet for our programs for the current federal fiscal year. So we're already being prorated based on 2016 dollars. So we're being funded less for housing vouchers for our participants. So we're having to put a pause on our voucher programs. Now, there was a leaked document that was published by the Washington Post last week that I'm sure many in the audience have seen, that is looking at a $6 billion cut to the HUD budget, which translates to a 14% decrease overall, and they're looking at zeroing out home and CDBG altogether. We're looking at significant cuts, $300 million cut nationwide for the voucher program. And public housing, they're looking at significant reductions for the capital fund that goes towards maintaining public housing, and operating fund to help with the subsidies for public housing. Luckily, we were ahead of the curve, our agency, on transitioning our public housing assets out of that program and into a more stable funding platform. But all HUD programs are at risk right now, and it's not looking good. As well as the 2011 Budget Control Act, which instituted severe across the board cuts for all agency programs. The sequestration is set to kick back in with the federal fiscal year 2018, which would be the beginning October 1. So if that gets instituted, we'd be looking at, along with the other proposed cuts, we'd be looking at a 600,000 loss of vouchers. That's 600 vouchers removed from nationwide. And we would be looking at significant impacts locally as well, probably looking at reducing our program by about 300 to 400 vouchers at that much of a reduction.
Okay.
So
Great news. Thanks.
Yeah.
Great. No, thank you for that. Welcome. So then, in terms of I guess, Mr. Flax, I have a question. I didn't mean to admonish you publicly, but you brought it up. So, no, I do appreciate all the work that you do very much. You mentioned Measure H in LA County and the possibility of a countywide initiative next year. How real is that? It's just...
I couldn't even say. Essentially what we're doing, what C3H is looking at, is taking interested parties down to Los Angeles to meet with the Home for Good folks from their United Way and their Chamber of Commerce, and getting a sense of how they were able to do so much over the last 10 years. Because, when I've approached like the Santa Barbara Foundation or other foundations about funding for more of our work, there's often the question of what's the role of the business community here locally, what's the role of the county, what's the role of the Santa Barbara Foundation, and essentially I think it's time for us, given the success that we're seeing in LA and elsewhere, to have the conversation, to at least understand better what business leaders are capable of, what they would support. I have heard talk kind of off the record about some kind of a bond measure that may be coming down the pike, but I don't know any specifics about it. But I want to make sure that homelessness is on the table if revenue proposals are going forward.
Great, thank you. Mr. Hart.
I'm curious if Chuck, if you know, sorry. One of the biggest costs to the public system is healthcare and emergency services at Cottage Hospital. And obviously that system is very stressed, under threat today too, particularly cuts at the federal level for Medicaid and through the ACA. But can you tell me anything about that, capturing savings through that system by intervening, proactively in getting people stabilized? The story that you told about the person falling at the Victoria Hotel is screams that, that money lost on providing that emergency care as opposed to solving that person's health needs up front seems like a huge percentage of what we're talking about today.
So you put your finger on one of the most critical issues, and Luke in particular, who's getting his social work degree, would argue that the homelessness issue is as much a healthcare issue as it is a housing issue. And if you want to hear from him, he may be even more of an expert than I am about it. The reality is that we're seeing increasingly, because of cost pressures, hospitals and other healthcare providers wanting to focus on this issue. And so what they've done typically at Cottage and at the other regional hospitals is they have internal social workers who tried their best to keep people out of the hospital, to work on primary care, to start to steer people away from emergency services. That's had some limited effect because they typically, like many of the agencies here, they can't go very far outside of the walls of the hospital to support people on the street. And so programs like Doctors Without Walls that Councilmember Murillo mentioned, and many others, the community clinics, PATH has some respite care beds. Increasingly, homeless service providers are recognizing their role in the healthcare delivery system. And you're right in that one of the biggest cost factors to our society from homelessness is the overuse of emergency services. And I mean, the famous article that people ought to check out by Malcolm Gladwell is called $1 Million Murray. I mean, it's a great read, and it really shows clearly that the cost savings that we could recoup as a society would be significant if we could figure out how to make that system more efficient, to get people to primary care, to do a better job of helping people with their, getting off the streets. So yes, and that's why we're now meeting regularly with Cottage Hospital. It's why Dignity Health gave us funding to do outreach in Santa Maria. And I've just had a meeting last week with CenCal. They're eager to talk more about the kinds of services that might be reimbursable. I know that many of our providers are looking at trying to develop programs that might be reimbursable through Medi-Cal to help with this problem. So yes, I mean, I think that's a critical issue.
And that's something to look forward potentially to even more savings as this collaboration becomes stronger between the healthcare providers and the outreach.
We have three primary measures. We have savings in healthcare, savings in or improvement in people's economic well-being, and improvement in housing. So yes, we're tracking that and trying to keep a close eye on it.
Thank you.
Okay, we do have public comment here, and if you haven't, there's some speaker slips there. I'll have 2 minutes. I have a little timer Here, if you come up to the podium, we'll start with Jose Arturo Gallegos, Rob Fredericks, and I know Glenn Batchelor will want to speak, so you'll be after that. Jose, you're first. And anyone else who would like to speak, if we can get a speaker slip, I'm happy to accommodate you.
Good afternoon, Madam Mayor, members of the council. As you all know, I am formerly homeless, coming up April, a resident at the Victoria Hotel. And I never had any advocates or anybody, to help me out. I mean, basically, Sharon Byrne wrote a letter of recommendation on behalf of my character. A gentleman works at the county, at Sonoma County Human Resources, and a very good friend of mine who's laid up at the hospital down San Fernando Valley, had a major stroke. But I'm going to try to make this as quickly as possible. And this is regarding feeding at the parks. And this afternoon, I looked this up on Google. And this is August 1st of last year. And in more than 70 cities, it's illegal to feed the homeless because, and here are just a few reasons that some cities have cited on their websites. The city is concerned about food safety and making the homeless ill. The city requires permits for a fee, of course, in order to distribute free food. The city has strict food preparation guidelines. The city requires food distribution to be done indoors only. The city wants to make homeless people go away. The city says that food given to the public cannot be prepared in a non-commercial kitchen. When I was homeless, I have gone to Miller Park many times. They used to do it 3 times a week. I think it's twice now. A few times on Sundays at Pershing Park. Many times. I said, no, I cannot deal with it because of the disruptive behavior, the drugs, alcohol, and several times I almost got into some fights with some of these individuals. So I'm just like, I can't deal with this. This has to stop. The parks are designed for people who want to take their kids, walk their dogs, throw a Frisbee around. This has got to stop.
Thank you.
End it.
All right. And I'll end the noise. There we go. I love that one. Come on. It's great. It's great. Works every time. Okay. There we go.
All right.
Mr. Fredericks.
Good afternoon, Madam Mayor, City Council members. I'm Rob Fredericks, Executive Director of the Housing Authority of the City of Santa Barbara. I'd first like to thank and commend C3H for their excellent efforts on the point-in-time count this past January and for the comprehensive report that they've produced that's in front of you all today, indicating the results. I also want to thank you and the city staff for their past and continued support for the community's efforts to reduce homelessness, not only to the Housing Authority's support that you saw on the slides on the wonderful developments that we've done, but for other community partners as well. It's what's made positive results happen. And in fact, I want to highlight that in the last 2 years, placements from the city of Santa Barbara proper, there have been from 2015, 2016, there have been a total of 418 housing placements, of which 125 were families, 239 children. Imagine that. We've been able to provide a safe place to call home for children to lay their heads on a pillow at night and be safe and warm. 239 children. Of the 418 placements, 216 were chronic homeless, 101 veterans. That's great. And as Chuck and Luke mentioned, we've done a number of reunifications. By my count on the placements over those 2 years, 32 reunifications, which is great. So these positive results are the efforts of many nonprofits. It takes truly a village of housers and service providers to make this work and to have positive results. Our agency in that 2-year time span specifically housed 141 of the chronically homeless individuals through our various programs. And while these efforts are really good to point to, the point-in-time count that you have in front of you shows that there's a lot more work that needs to be done, much more. And in order to really have an impact, we have to properly direct our resources, as Chuck said. There's a lot of resource redirection that's needed. And one of the main things is, we've underproduced housing by about 1.5 million units throughout the state, and Santa Barbara is no exception. And there are other measures throughout the state that have passed. Alameda County, bond measure A1, $580 million. Santa Clara County, bond measure A, $980 million. San Mateo, measure K, half-cent sales tax. Santa Monica, measure GSH, a half-cent sales tax, all for permanent supportive housing. These are things that we should be looking at a broader Santa Barbara County community to do. Thank you.
Thank you.
If I could ask a question,
Yeah,
please.
go ahead, Mr. Fredericks.
Hey, sorry.
Phew.
More music.
No,
Do you know
don't have,
if those
I don't cut
bond
you off.
issues resulted in more or fewer homeless?
So those bond measures just passed in November, and Triple H just all those
week,
bond
2
measures
weeks
just passed in last November.
Too soon to measure
Too
then.
soon to measure. I would think that it would reduce homelessness from my perspective.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. Glenn Batchelor, Joan Sanger, and the final speaker will be B. Molina.
This has been brought up so many times today that I forgot what I was going to say. But very quickly, concern about the application for the Landlord Liaison Program is that this program is so new and growing so fast that the application's already outdated. I think it was due in December, the application, and we had housed 30 or 40 folks. Now we're up to 80, just three months later. That's how fast this is growing. And it projects to house somewhere between 125 and 200 just in 2017. That's how fast it's growing. It's like some high-tech companies, if you will. And I don't know how a rating system or metrics capture that, number one. Number two, I don't know how a rating system and metrics capture potential. Seattle has housed 7,000 homeless people in 6 years, and they grew from year 1 to year 5 by 10 times, 10x. So if we house 50 people in the first year, that would imply that we're going to house 500 a year by the 5th year. I don't know how a metric system captures that, and I would just hope that whomever and whatever this process is, which I'm not terribly familiar with, would keep that in mind and keep it on the radar. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Let me ask you, the 20,000 applications specifically would go to, I'd go to the Landlord Liaison Project, but the application you had for $20,000 to the CDBG funds, what specifically, how would that money be used?
It would be used in a number of ways, but since it's a new program and it's growing so fast, some of that is infrastructure, some of that is case management, because a big part of this program is there's a full-time case management person. That's partly why this program works. So some of it's infrastructure and primarily case management.
So is there a rent health assistance component? No. Okay. I was trying to find another source of funding.
Yeah, it's coming from other places.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you. Joan Sanger, B. Molina, and then Ralph Gehling.
Madam Mayor and Council, I just wanted to throw a few ideas out at you. The poor mayor already got my laundry list last night, so I'm just going to give you 3 ideas of just a way to look at things a little bit differently, and I just thought it might just spur some thoughts of how to consider these things. One of the things to consider is when we talk about homeless people in this town, we're not really considering those people that are couch surfing, those people, young people who work here, people who run some of, the programs here. In fact, they can't afford to live here. So those people aren't even counted in the homeless count. So that's something that I just thought you might want to think about. And the challenge of the expense of housing in this town, it cannot go undiscussed in a really, really serious way. One of the things I thought of, and it may be completely off the wall, but is the concept that we would consider looking at the zoning and planning regulations and to say to people, because it's not that there isn't housing, there's just a lot of empty housing. There are people with garage apartments, there are possible garage apartments, there are people with basements, there are people with places where lower income people could live. And if you could say, okay, we'll give you amnesty on your whatever you have that's offsite or whatever that's not a safety violation, and then if you will lease to somebody for 70% below market value for 5 years, and that we would provide that sort of income level. If you would do that, we'll give you the permitting to put in a kitchen or a toilet or whatever it is that you need to house that person. Because the way I look at it as a sort of new person to town is to look at all these empty places that we're not utilizing rather than building new facilities. That's just an idea that I thought of. The other is when we talk about people needing mental health services, this town's filled with holistic practitioners. And a lot of the issues that these people have is they can't get food, and even if they are in a housing facility, they don't have access because they don't have transportation to good food. There are all kinds of practitioners, health practitioners, that could help them with that. Practitioners that can help them with other kinds of issues that might be related to PTSD and, traumatic brain syndrome. Okay, I'm done. Okay, that would be about it. And the other is to think about cooperative businesses for these people and ways that they could actually co-own a business that would be a sheltered workshop. I have all kinds of ideas about this stuff. If you want to ask me, I'll be glad to talk to you about it.
Thank you. B. Molina?
Good afternoon. I'm here representing the Milpas Community Association. And I want to commend the city for all the work it has done. I want to remind the city for Milpas on the homeless issue that of all the communities in Santa Barbara, we have suffered the most with this issue. Our community has been impacted in every single way that we can talk, and I don't want to take my 2 minutes because you already heard it, you already know it. We are grateful that PATH came in and ran the program. But sadly, I have to say that while PATH has done an amazing job, the problem is beyond PATH now. It's beyond PATH. One of the things that we are going to come to talk to you about is not having the winter shelter. The winter shelter brought us hundreds of new homeless people that we have never seen before. They were more aggressive, more mental health issues. They created more problems, da-da-da-da-da-da-da. But the thing that I didn't think I would ever come up here and say after working on this issue for, 7 years, pretty aggressively, is that we want that homeless shelter moved. It needs to get out of that area. This area, we have been walking every business since December, and we can't have any of the businesses talk about any issues except homeless. And I asked somebody, well, the homeless issue only impacts up to Haley. I'm sorry, it hits up all the way to Cannon Perdido and up to the bowl. So it is a problem. So I'm here with mixed feelings. I'm just saying this is an issue that I think has run away from us. It's making a lot of pressure on a lot of social programs, on the city as a whole, State Street too, but certainly Milpas. And so I don't know what to say. If I want you to reconsider what you're talking about, everything is valid. But we want that shelter gone.
So, Ms. Molina, may I ask, where should it go?
Well, one of the areas I thought you had considered a long time ago, if I recall, was way above the, is it off San Antonio? Behind the jail way out there?
In the county?
Yes. I know. There is no perfect spot.
So
but is there homes out there?
I'm just curious, have you approached the county about putting a homeless shelter
and
on
would
the
you
county
kill
campus?
us if we had done that first?
No, I'm
we're
just
going
asking
through a
the question.
process of, this is just kind of, this issue has resurfaced where it had gone away for years with us. And we just don't see anything else. We're trying. We've worked very hard. You know that we have cleaned up Milpas a lot. And we can't keep fighting this when there's so many new homeless coming in.
Thank you.
Madam Mayor.
Yes, Mr. Hotchkiss.
Ms. Molina, I alleged earlier that the elimination of the lunch program at PATH, Casa Esperanza, had a good effect on the neighborhood. Was I correct in that?
Oh, yes. But the winter shelter brought in people from, I don't know where they all came from.
Okay.
Oh, and I think it was a combination of other cities and early release from jail, because the types that we saw are not the people that are staying at PATH. They really aren't. These individuals are much more homeless issues, are fighting, are drinking. There's a lot more drug dealing in the street. These are not the people that we have gotten used to seeing at PATH. So why are they coming here? There's a shelter in Santa Barbara.
Got it. Thank you very much.
Mr. Gayling? Do we have anyone from PATH here? Okay, I'll have a question after Mr. Geiling.
Good afternoon, Madam Mayor, members of council. Rolf Geiling, president of the Santa Barbara Rescue Mission. I just wanted to make you aware, I think a lot of you already are, of a tremendous resource you have in the community. If I understand the budget pie charts correctly, my organization alone spends twice what the city spends to help the homeless, and that is money raised from private individuals in the community. If we put together a lot of the nonprofits in this room, there's a tremendous resource in our community and a tremendous demonstration of compassion within our community for people who struggle. And so I think that's very important as you are in a workshop considering how you address this issue, that you really are aware of and facilitate that resource in the different nonprofits and really the people in the community who are willing to give generously to alleviate suffering. So what I've heard today and what I think is very clear is as we go about, this is a very complex problem. It requires specific areas of specialization there are acute circumstances that demand very individualized responses. What I think is very important for the city is to have a larger strategic platform on how do we as a community express compassion, extend help to needy people in our community, while also keeping in view quality of life issues and kind of our freedom as a community to move around and to utilize that community. Because I think that's really what you could provide for us is, as a community, do we make a decision? Because I think everybody in Santa Barbara is compassionate to people who struggle. Yet there are real impacts for an organization like ours about how we go about that. And I think it would really serve the community if you were to if we really, not just you, but we as a community were able to articulate that. So thanks very much.
Thank you. And I think you.
May I ask this?
Yeah, after I congratulate him on 10 years of service, that just recently happened. So congratulations to that. But go ahead, Ms. Murillo.
So Ms. Molina was talking about an influx of a new population this winter. Did you notice it at the rescue mission, sir?
That has not been our observation, that there's all of a sudden an influx of new people. I mean, at the Rescue Mission, we don't alter our capacity during the winter months. We are dealing with a population that is by nature transitory, so there are people coming from different parts, but I'm not directly involved with casework. I didn't note that or hear that from my staff that there was a specific influx.
Thank you.
Thank you. Did you also have a question?
Yeah, I had a question too. Thank you for your comments. Can you spend a little more time unpacking that, strategic vision about generosity in the community and leveraging nonprofits? Because that is exactly what our human services funding is to do, is to leverage the limited public dollars with the nonprofit sector to provide services, at orders of magnitude more than we could do ourselves. Yeah. So what are you trying to tell us directly with those words about strategic vision? And you don't need to use code. You can say exactly what it is you're trying to say.
The analogy I would give with each individual that comes into our program, we are an organization that's driven by compassion, and I show compassion to that individual. Mainly my staff does, really. But within the help that we're willing to extend, we have boundaries, and we say we will help you in this way, this way, and this way. There are certain things we will not do for you, and I think that is a very appropriate and caring conversation that we can have as a community to say, if you are struggling with homelessness, if you find yourself in every one of these stories is incredibly tragic. And so if we say, as a community, we extend compassion to you in your tragic situation, there are certain ways in which we will help you, and there are certain things that we just cannot help you with or just will not tolerate. I think that's, as somebody who spends, most of his life helping people, that I think is an appropriate thing to do as a caregiver. And I think, so what I would say is the analogy I'm giving is, like I said, whereas most agencies have to deal with that on an individual level, I would say as a community, we can have that conversation as well.
That's really helpful. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. The bigger picture, he just reminded me, many of you might have remembered the late, great Roger Heroux, and back in, I think, 2004, before the 10-year plan to end chronic homelessness was put together, he put together a report for the county that showed what is the public dollar, not just the public dollar, what is the full amount of funding in all capacities, the jails, the hospitals, law enforcement, public, nonprofits in the county. And I think the number, if I'm remembering back in 2004, was $36 million a year. on managing a system, right? And that didn't even count all the capital improvements and things like that. So, but that I just realized that's almost a 13-year-old document at this point. Thank you for coming up. If you maybe introduce yourself, but I guess. And if you don't have this information now, it certainly in the future would be happy to get it. But just in terms of the winter shelter, first off, I know it's plans to end April 1st, right? So in a couple of weeks. Do you know the people who are there, whether they were already here ahead of time or did they come here? Do you have any kind of real data and statistics and facts on that? Because I think that
I'll give you what I have.
Yeah, that would be helpful.
Thank you, Madam Mayor and members of the council. My name is Tessa Madden, for those of you who I have not met. I'm the regional director of PATH here in Santa Barbara. So we've been pulling some stats kind of in preparation for closing and understanding and trying to get a broader understanding of who our population is, where they're going to go after winter shelter, which is obviously a concern for everyone in the community and one of the kind of issues with the concept of winter shelter in general. We have had 353 unique residents during winter shelter this year, 25% of whom came to winter shelter last year. And presumably the year before. I did not pull that data, but they're kind of winter shelter repeat offenders, if you will, who are coming to the shelter, but we don't ever see throughout the rest of the year trying to access our year-round program beds. And so that's about 88 individual clients. And, so we do operate on local preference. So all the folks who have come in are from Santa Barbara County, not necessarily the city of Santa Barbara, but we do screen for local preference unless they are folks that have come through Cottage Hospital and then come kind of back onto a winter shelter bed. That's kind of one of the only ways in if they come in from a referral directly from the hospital because of our contract with them.
That helps. Thank you very much. So that concludes public comment. I mean, I think as I remember from our work session in December, this was to help put a big picture on all the things that we're doing, and especially in preparing for the budget and the funding involved, and just to get a better sense for all of us to know all the different things going on. And first off, I just want to say how grateful I am for everyone in this room and those listening and so many others who have some role to play in reducing homelessness. And I think it is right. There's a lot going on. There's a lot of challenges still, but something must be happening correctly, because we have seen over 8 years a consistent decline in the number of homeless individuals. I frequently say success is invisible. The people we used to see and that we tend to focus on in our area, when they become housed and become self-reliant, we don't see them anymore because they're housed and self-reliant, and we don't have that same kind of visual reminder, and so we only see what we see. And so partly telling our story about what we're doing and what works, I think, is very important. I'm personally very concerned of what's going to happen with HUD and how that's going to impact us and what we can do to be self-reliant should we experience such a dramatic decrease in funding. So those are questions that are going through my mind. But I'd like to open it up if there's any comments or questions by my colleagues. And we were scheduled to close at 5, so if we can try to keep within that timing, that would be great. So maybe start this way and work on down. Ms. Murillo.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. I did want to explore the idea in terms of the parks. If a park ranger is more cost effective than a uniformed police officer, I should know that answer. But if I know how expensive, rightly, a sworn officer is with salary and benefits, but if a park ranger is less expensive and would be able to patrol the parks, then maybe we can consider that possibility, because I think they're law enforcement, right? If I'm correct, so I would toss that out there. And Chief, I'd like to congratulate you on the restorative policing program. I know you inherited it in a way, but I just came this afternoon from a panel discussion, and it was called "How do we keep mentally ill people out of jail?" And our restorative program was talked about quite a bit. And so I would just encourage our police department to continue to train officers in dealing with people with behavioral wellness issues. And then I fully support the restorative program. We need that kind of social worker / police officer to continue that good work. And then the winter shelter, I know there's a tension on in the east side, what problems are caused by path and what problems are caused by people who like to hang out down there. I hope that our alcohol sales ordinance will provide some relief along Milpas Street, where I hope we pass that, and it would prohibit the sale of the tall 40-ouncer of the high-octane malt liquor. Haven't had that in a long time, I have to say myself. But, maybe that would help, right? Because this is all incremental. We do what we can. And, of course, the east side should not suffer from those impacts. And on the other hand, if it's cold and rainy, and this was a cold winter, I was glad that there was a place for homeless people to go. So let's keep working on that. And those are my ideas right now. I'm grateful to Christine Schwartz. She and I went to New Beginnings, took me to Denver, and we learned about how to help homeless veterans. I've made some notes, and that's a bright spot, right? At least that funding is still there. And homeless war veterans, there's money for them, thank God. And so there are some bright spots in all of this. And people living in their cars, that's housing too, I guess. And I know safe parking gets a whole lot of attention, national attention, rightly. But I really give a lot of credit to our restorative policing program, too. The yellow shirts, Chuck Reed is like an angel out there on the streets. And I really give you a lot of credit for continuing that program, Chief. Thank you.
Well, I would just say that this issue has been at the forefront in the city for decades. And we have evolved a very sophisticated system of working with folks in this community on these issues, and yet there is a tension that remains. And I don't know that that is resolvable, but it's something that can be worked on, and it is being worked on. And I think this presentation today really gets to how complicated this is and how it doesn't lend itself to simplistic views of complex situations. We're never going to have enough resources to fully fund all the projects that have worth and value, and there probably does need to be additional work on the efficacy of what is most effective, because we have to figure out how to be smart about using the dollars that we're doing. But I think the fundamental structure we have in place with the CDBG funds and the human services dollars is the right model. It does leverage that money, and it puts the responsibility in the hands of the nonprofits that are directly doing this work. I'm very interested in the leverage that comes from the AmeriCorps program. That seems like a remarkably efficient investment. $9,000 a year, federal money, something hopefully that isn't being threatened. I understand the complexity of that is how do we get more people to participate in that? How do we get the word out? And that might be something that we should think about using our limited dollars to do more of. If we can turn city dollars, marketing dollars into $9,000 staff people that can really make that kind of impact, that's a really great investment of dollars. And maybe that's something the private sector could look at too in terms of helping in that regard. I think that's a business model that would appeal to folks. And I see Mr. Opplinger nodding his head, so that's something to take from this. But I just, I always want us to be cautious about simplistic responses to complex problems. Everything seems that way today, and increasingly the answers in Washington are erring on the simplistic, reactionary side of the equation. And locally, we know differently, and we know better about how to handle these problems. And I think that's our job then, is to stay the course on the things that are working and resist simple solutions that don't actually make the change we're looking for.
I want to take a slightly different tack because I know how to have a good time. I spent my afternoon at the Cottage Hospital at an opioid conference. And my point is that a big part of what we see out there is caused by drug and alcohol abuse. And I think we spend a lot of time dealing with the aftermath and the products of what has happened, and we don't spend a lot of time trying not to get there in the first place. And there's going to be a never-ending source of our problem as long as these things are propagated, as long as they are so constant in our society. And clearly, we have the population of people that are the people we've seen out there for decades and decades, the chronic abusers, but then we have this new, fresh crop that we see out there all the time. And frankly, probably most of our police issues are with this new, fresh crop of very aggressive young people who aren't there necessarily because of economic or financial reasons. They're there because drug abuse has gotten them where they are today. And I know that's not exactly the point of the meeting today, but it is a big part of what we do. And I don't want to lose sight of our ability as a community to understand the problem, to face the problem, and to get education started early. And I'm certainly, because I appreciate school resource officers in particular who have the ability to be, great role models. But along that line, as adults, to realize what goes on with, particularly with the prescription drugs. And as we go forward we're going to deal with issues with Prop 64. We're going to have a lot of community issues that we're going to have to deal with on a stepped up basis to try to catch it up front, so it doesn't evolve into our issues on the street that we're going to be dealing with in perpetuity. So it's not just the financial issues; it's other issues as well. And I hope we don't lose sight of that. Thank you.
So I want to thank everyone here in the audience for all the hard work you do on trying to solve these issues. We had a meeting yesterday to talk about winter shelter closing, and it was very productive. And I heard a lot of stories and a lot about what people are doing to get prepared for that. So it was very encouraging. I was really excited to hear what Mr. Gehling said and what Mr. Flack said about the structural and the strategy and the data collection. I think that's really going to be the way of leveraging innovation and moving forward in order to leverage all the hard hours that people are putting in. I think Luke said it best. I think he was the one who said it's just a matter of having conversations with each of these people, and that it's time intensive, but the data can help us improve our ability to make those conversations happen. And kind of like Mr. Rouse, he talked about one of the causes being drugs. One of the other causes is the housing issue, and particularly the workforce housing. So I want to just go over a few numbers because it's this working poor who are really at risk of becoming homeless, particularly if the economy does take another dive. And I just wrote out a few numbers. So the workforce is the 60 to 120% of area median income, and our housing element for the 8-year cycle of 2014 to 2022 indicated that we need to build 1,521 workforce units. This is low and moderate housing. That's the goal that Sacramento, the Housing and Community Development Department, and SBCAG has set for the city of Santa Barbara. And so far with our affordable housing program for that workforce housing, the numbers we have now, we're looking at a net loss of 100 units in that 50 to 120% range because we're going to lose 24 units to demolition and then another 75 units of induced demand from the 4 market rental units that are being built. And we're adding in 3,000 new jobs at median income and below. So add that to the 1,521 units that we were supposed to build and the 100 that we're losing, and we're in trouble. And then the last number, lucky number 7 is not so lucky. This is how many for sale units we're building so far with our plan. So if your relatives want to buy a house, good luck, because buying a house is really the most secure way of guaranteeing your future. It's the American dream, and it's what we really want to push. But right now, our renters have no chance of moving into the for sale market. So that's something that I hope we can really change in the near future. Thank you.
I'm not going to deal with the housing figures there. I don't think Santa Barbara is ever going to build its way out of the housing problem. But no matter what program we support, my goal, and I think it should be the goal of everybody, is that we are helping people up and not just enabling them to stay in the same place. It's sometimes difficult to think in those terms, and that's why I was asking about food in the parks, et cetera. Are we really helping people move to a better place, or are we just allowing them to stay there? And I hope we're going to help them move up. And if that's the overall philosophy of whatever programs we take, then we'll be doing the right thing. And if we don't keep that in mind, we will be making a mistake.
Well, again, thank everyone for being here. Just some key dates I know coming up as it relates to budgeting the CDBG. It's on the 28th at 6 p.m. Mid-April, I forget which council meeting, we're going to get our draft budget, but the fire and police budget is on May 17th at 2. And then the following Monday, May 22nd, also at 2, will be the community development budget hearing, which is, I think, where a lot of these other funds, is that where it's going to be in terms of path and all the other, what we're talking about today would be in the community development budget presentation? Yes?
It'll also be the path request and any outside organization requests, I believe, are at your last
the final
budget
one,
hearing. Yeah.
right, which will be at, not that one. We have a lot of budget hearings, it's, but, I think on the, well, anyway, one of those, we'll find out when you have the budget about but I guess the point is to keep track of this is to follow the budget hearings. Anyone can come to any budget hearing on any item, but we'll be focusing on specific things at specific times. So anything else? Anything else from you, Ms. Gray? And thank you. Actually, I just want to thank Sue Gray twice in 2 days, but I thought this was very well put together, and thank you to Mr. Flax as well. So thank you. So Ms. Murillo had something, and then
I was just going to suggest people check in with C3H. We have our meetings. Our policy council meets quarterly, but the regional coordination is so we meet every other month, and
policy council,
and then the regional coordination is monthly. Yeah. Thank you.
Go ahead, Mr. Dominguez.
I want to acknowledge a gentleman standing in the back very quietly who was in the movie, Officer Hove, who's the... He's the city...
Ask him about his bread.
Hove's loaves.
He's the city employee who's had the most face-to-face contact with the homeless and has done it admirably, and we are so much better off, and they're so much better off because of his presence and his kindness and his compassion. So thank you very much.
Great way to end the work session. Thank you so much. We are adjourned.